today's episode, we examine a winter climb where a guide told his clients the weather was improving. On that basis, the group chose to keep moving higher into the route. That choice would quietly narrow every option that followed, long before anyone realized it had. It was February 14th, 2015, just after sunrise, on the upper reaches of Huntington Ravine on Mount Washington. Winds at lower elevations appeared manageable, and from the trailhead, the mountain looked deceptively stable. But weather bulletins issued earlier that morning warned of rapidly increasing winds and whiteout conditions moving in from the west. Forecasters described it as a tightening window, not a clearing one. Despite those warnings, 4 climbers had already committed to the ravine, moving upward under the belief that the worst conditions had passed, and that belief would shape every decision that followed. Arthur Brooke was 34 years old and served as the guide for the group. He worked remotely as a software quality assurance tester for a small tech firm in Portland, and guiding weekend climbs helped supplement his income while building experience toward more advanced certifications. Climbing had also become his structure after a recent divorce. It gave him direction when other parts of his life felt unstable. Arthur was not reckless in the usual sense. He followed procedures, knew the terrain, and had completed multiple winter ascents. But he was deeply invested in finishing this climb. It was a requirement he needed to complete before qualifying for a higher-level technical course later that year. Missing it would mean rescheduling, losing money he couldn't easily replace, and delaying progress he had worked years to reach. Huntington Ravine is a steep, bowl-shaped glacial cirque carved into the east face of Mount Washington, and it behaves very differently from the lower slopes below it. In winter, the terrain acts like a wind tunnel. Air accelerates as it's forced into the confined walls, then rebounds unpredictably off rock bands and ice faces. Gusts don't arrive evenly. They slam laterally, twisting ropes, loading anchors from the side, and pushing climbers off balance at the exact moments when precision matters most. Ice forms in layers that can look solid from a distance, but are often thin veneers over granite, bonded just enough to hold weight until a sudden change in force causes them to shear. As elevation increases, the angle steepens, protection options narrow, and retreat routes overlap with ascent lines, meaning any reversal requires the same technical commitment as going up, often more. The warnings issued that morning reflected those realities. Forecasts called for sustained winds exceeding 80 miles per hour at elevation, with gusts strong enough to strip ice from the walls and collapse visibility into whiteout conditions before midday. Huntington Ravine was specifically flagged as high risk because wind loading there doesn't just make climbing harder. It actively destabilizes anchors and turns minor slips into uncontrollable swings. In that terrain, timing is everything. A route that feels manageable early can become mechanically hostile within a few hundred vertical feet, long before climbers have a clear signal that conditions have crossed the line from difficult to unrecoverable. That day, Arthur had checked the forecast at the trailhead. Phone records showed his phone contained cached forecasts and screenshots from earlier updates. Later advisories were not saved or accessed. When the others asked about conditions, Arthur told them the weather looked clear and was expected to improve, pointing to a possible break later in the day. He did not mention the active wind warning or the forecasted increase in gusts. No one else checked for themselves, and the group moved forward on his word. From there, the climb shifted from weighing risk to maintaining progress. The forecast itself never changed, and the weather that followed matched the warnings issued earlier that morning. What changed was what the group believed, and once they entered the ravine, retreat was no longer a simple option. The group left Pinkham Notch just after sunrise. Temperatures were well below freezing, but the forest sheltered them from the wind, and visibility remained clear. The first hour passed without incident, reinforcing the sense that the plan was holding. Arthur set a steady pace, speaking calmly and keeping the group moving. By the time they broke above treeline, the mountain began to show signs of what had been forecast. Wind moved across the snow in sharp bursts, strong enough to force brief pauses. Snow skimmed sideways along the slope instead of settling. The temperature dropped further, and the open terrain offered no protection. These were not yet extreme conditions, but they were early indicators that the window was closing faster than expected. At around 4,200 feet, steady gusts began cutting through the ravine. Climbers later described having to widen their stance and lean into the slope to keep their balance as the wind pushed sideways across the ice. Arthur stopped the group briefly and looked up the ravine before telling them the conditions were still manageable. According to post-incident statements, he said the wind was expected to ease higher up and that they were still on schedule to move through the technical section before anything deteriorated. Climbers from another party lower in the ravine later said the wind was already strong enough to affect balance at that point, forcing deliberate foot placement and frequent pauses. They watched Arthur's group stop briefly, then continue upward into the narrowing section of the ravine. The group moved on after Arthur said conditions were still workable, relying on his call as the guide, while the wind continued to build around them. By mid-morning, the ravine no longer felt open. The walls seemed closer, fading in and out as wind-driven snow erased depth and contrast. Sound flattened into a constant rush, making it hard to tell where the wind ended and the terrain began. Verbal communication dropped off. The group relied on rope tension and quick hand signals, small cues that worked only as long as everything stayed predictable. At around 10:30 a.m., visibility tightened to roughly 50 feet. Snow lifted off the ravine floor and moved sideways, scraping across the ice rather than falling from above. The wind stopped cycling and settled into a steady force, pressing against the climbers and loading the face unevenly. One climber suggested stopping to reassess. Arthur, guiding the group, said turning back would mean down climbing through the same wind without anchors already in place. He told them the system had stabilized and that continuing upward was the safer option. The group accepted that explanation and moved on. From that point forward, the climb was no longer being evaluated. It was being carried out. Just after 11 a.m., the group reached the technical ice section of the ravine. The slope steepened to roughly 70 degrees, eliminating any chance to stand upright or regroup comfortably. From that point on, every climber relied fully on crampon points, ice tools, and the rope system. The ice appeared solid at first glance, hard and blue, but it had been scoured by wind for hours. In places, the surface masked thinner layers beneath, where bonding to the rock was uneven and unpredictable. By around 11:15 a.m., sustained winds were strong enough to push climbers sideways, with sharper gusts cutting through the ravine. Verbal communication was no longer practical. Each climber focused on maintaining balance and placing tools carefully, moving one at a time to limit exposure. Turning around was no longer straightforward. The terrain required upward progress to reach any position where a controlled retreat could be organized. Arthur moved third on the rope as they entered the steepest section. The anchor above him had been placed quickly to reduce time spent exposed, driven into ice that looked dense from the surface. There was no secondary screw in place. Time, exposure, and wind pressure had narrowed the setup to a single placement. It was a practical choice under worsening conditions. And from that point forward, the entire system depended on that placement holding against increasing wind and load. As the ravine narrowed, the wind began to funnel straight into the line of ascent. Gusts hit from the side, pulling climbers away from the wall and loading the rope unevenly. The rope stayed tight and vibrated under tension. Small shards of ice moved across the face at eye level, lifted and carried by the wind rather than knocked loose by tools. Progress slowed. Every move required more balance, and every stop drained heat from hands and feet. The lead climber reached a small stance and started building the next anchor. Dexterity was already fading, and stopping too long risked losing the ability to work the hardware. Moving quickly meant trusting ice that had not been fully checked. An ice screw was placed near a seam in the wall, biting into what looked like solid ice. It seated firmly and held body weight without movement. What could not be seen was the thin layer beneath it, formed by repeated freeze-thaw cycles and shaped by constant wind exposure. Arthur moved toward the anchor with his body kept close to the wall to limit side pull. The rope system was fully loaded and committed, with no slack to absorb sudden force. By that point, the group had passed the last practical place to reverse the climb. Retreat would have required dismantling anchors under worsening wind while suspended on steep terrain. Another gust came through, stronger than the last, striking the wall from the side and loading the rope and anchor at the same time. The rope tone changed as tension spiked. That surge was enough to overwhelm what the ice could hold. The system shifted from stable to unstable in a moment, removing the remaining margin the group had been relying on. The wind surged through the ravine in a single, violent push. Climbers nearby later described it as strong enough to force them flat against the ice, momentarily overpowering balance and footing. Arthur was on the wall when it hit, mid-move, having just shifted his weight upward onto the rope system he had set. The timing mattered. As his feet unloaded and his full weight transferred to the anchor, the gust drove his body outward, adding a sudden sideways force to the line. The anchor failed instantly. The ice screw did not slowly creep or bend. The thin ice around it fractured, and the placement blew apart under the combined load of the wind and body weight. The rope went slack. Arthur's feet lost contact with the wall, and he was pulled outward before dropping below the anchor point. He struck the rock face almost immediately. The first impact twisted his body sideways, with his shoulder and helmet taking the hit against exposed granite. The helmet cracked but did not stop the rotation. A second impact followed moments later, harder, knocking his ice axe out of controlled alignment as his body continued to fall. As he dropped, the axe swung freely. Roughly 60 feet down, the pick caught against his chest as momentum carried him forward, driving it beneath the collarbone. From that point, there was no further coordinated movement. His body continued falling another 100 feet before coming to rest on a snow-covered ledge below. Climbers above reported no signs of motion after the final impact. Above him, the rope came tight as the load transferred through the system. One climber was pulled hard into the wall and dropped to a knee. Another lost an ice tool when the rope snapped sideways, but remained clipped in. The sound of the anchor failure carried through the ravine, metal tearing free, rope striking ice, then faded under the wind. Helmet cameras from climbers higher on the route later showed the moment clearly, the anchor ripping out, the rope jerking, Arthur accelerating downward and disappearing from view. The audio captured only wind, impact, and then sustained gusts overpowering everything else. There was no shouting after that. The wind made it difficult to stay upright, let alone move. Snow began blasting through the ravine in sheets, flattening contrast, cutting visibility to less than 30 feet. The failed anchor sat above a steep section of wall with no alternate line around it. Arthur's last visible position was partly obscured by an overhang, intermittently visible through blowing snow. Reaching that spot would have required removing the remaining protection and committing another climber to the same exposure that had just caused the failure. The group stayed clipped in, focused on maintaining position as conditions worsened. Gusts came in sustained waves, strong enough to press bodies into the ice even while tethered. Ice began forming rapidly on ropes and hardware, increasing drag and making adjustments slow and awkward. Gloves stiffened. Fine motor control dropped. Communication broke down to brief gestures that were often missed as spindrift filled the air. As conditions worsened, the climb stopped being about upward progress and shifted into a struggle to hold position. One climber began shivering hard enough that his balance suffered. Another scraped repeatedly at the ice, unable to reset crampon points on the glazed surface. Wind pushed laterally through the ravine, stripping heat and flattening contrast until ice and rock blurred together. There was no shelter and no stable place to rest. When the group finally attempted to descend, the wind Arthur had said would ease was already established, and every option carried risk they no longer had the capacity to absorb. The first attempt to retreat stalled almost immediately. When Arthur set the rappel, the rope locked as soon as it was weighted. Ice had formed inside the anchor hardware, and the line would not feed. They worked it loose by hand, chipping and pulling until it moved again, but the delay cost time and heat. On the next attempt, a climber stepped onto the rope as a gust struck the wall. His feet slid. He swung outward and had to be hauled back to the stands. The recovery took several minutes and left the group slower and less coordinated than before. Arthur continued resetting anchors and changing rope angles as conditions worsened, treating each problem as a delay rather than a stop. Wind-driven ice began coating the wall in thin, fast-forming layers, dulling edges and filling the threads of screws and rings. Holds that had been usable minutes earlier turned slick and unreliable. Above them, the route tightened into steeper, more exposed ice where spacing mattered, and pauses carried consequence. Below them, the descent demanded clean foot placements and steady balance on terrain that no longer allowed correction. Each anchor took longer to build. Each transition burned more time and strength. Communication narrowed to hand signals and brief nods, many of which were missed or misunderstood as spindrift swept across the wall. The first clear sign of failure came without noise or movement. One climber, clipped in close to the wall, stopped responding to signals. His posture sagged forward, helmet resting against the ice, harness fully weighted. His hands remained on his tools, but they no longer moved. When another climber reached him and adjusted his stance, there was no reaction. The wind swallowed any sound. His position did not change. They attempted to continue past him. During the next descent setup, another climber transferred weight onto the rope as a gust struck the wall. The force pushed him sideways before his feet could set. He swung hard into the ice, striking shoulder first, then his helmet. Before the rope snapped tight, the anchor held under the load. His body went slack immediately. When he was pulled back to the stance, he did not assist or resist. His weight hung dead in the harness. From that point on, the system stopped functioning as a unit. Lines froze where they lay. Anchors jammed as ice filled moving parts faster than it could be cleared. Spacing between climbers increased as each adjustment took longer to complete and required more effort. Arthur attempted to reorganize the sequence, shifting positions and reassigning movement, but the wall no longer allowed clean transitions. The remaining climber tried a different option, moving upward instead of down, angling toward a section of wall that looked slightly less exposed to the wind. He gained only a few meters. Ice had glazed the surface, turning what should have been secure placements into a smooth skin over rock. Spindrift poured through the ravine in sheets, cutting visibility down to shifting gray. When he reached for his next step, his crampon failed to bite. It skated across the ice, and his weight moved past the point he could recover. He fell backward into open space. The rope caught him, but the arrest was violent. His body slammed into the wall, swung outward, then struck again as the line snapped tight under load. Witnesses lower in the ravine later described the impact as sudden and heavy, the kind that leaves no room for controlled movement afterward. He remained conscious only briefly, long enough for his hands to move, grasping at air and ice without coordination, before going still. He was left hanging in place as wind continued to drive ice across the route, the rope slowly stiffening as it froze. Investigators later noted that from that point on, the system was effectively locked. The ropes hardened into rigid lines, anchors iced over and could not be reset. No climber could move without risking another uncontrolled fall. There was no sudden spike in weather and no unexpected collapse of terrain. Conditions continued to worsen exactly as forecast, tightening the ravine minute by minute. What remained on the wall was not an active rescue scenario, but a frozen sequence. Bodies held in place by gear that could no longer be adjusted, in a storm that never needed to surprise anyone to finish what had already been set in motion. We cover more climbing disasters like this. Consider subscribing if you want to see how trusted decisions on the mountain can turn routine ascents into fatal chains of failure. By early afternoon, rescue coordination began at lower elevations, but conditions in the ravine exceeded safe limits. Ground teams staged and waited, monitoring wind speeds as they climbed past operational thresholds. Helicopter crews prepared and stood down repeatedly as turbulence tore through the upper mountain. Rotor wash would have destabilized snow and ice in the ravine, making aerial insertion unsafe even if visibility improved. Snowfall began filling ledges and coating anchors, erasing any remaining margin for entry. As daylight faded, Huntington Ravine held 4 climbers at different heights along the route, connected by frozen ropes and immobile anchors. Each climber ultimately fell between roughly 150 and 220 feet over the course of the failure sequence. These were not clean drops. Based on injury patterns observed during recovery, each fall involved repeated impacts, ice, rock, and compacted snow, redirecting bodies and increasing injury with every strike. Helmets reduced surface damage, but could not absorb the cumulative force. Ice tools tore loose during rotation, causing penetrating injuries. Packs shifted violently, altering balance mid-fall. Rope segments snapped free and recoiled uselessly behind them. Rescue leaders classified the situation as active but unreachable. Sending teams into the ravine under those conditions would have meant adding more climbers to the same wall, facing the same failures. No attempt was made that night. When conditions finally eased the following morning, teams were able to enter the ravine on foot. Even then, progress was slow and methodical. Wind had scoured the upper walls overnight, leaving sections of hard, brittle ice layered over older snow. Every anchor was approached cautiously, tested by hand, before any weight was committed. Ice had to be chipped out of rings and carabiners before ropes could move. Rescuers advanced one at a time, spacing themselves to limit exposure as spindrift continued to sweep intermittently through the gully. The first climber was found still upright against the wall, clipped into the rope exactly where he had stopped the day before. His harness was fully weighted, his helmet pressed into the ice, his boots planted unevenly on a narrow stance. There were no signs of movement around his feet or tools, no scuffing, no repositioning. The rope above and below him was frozen solid, locked into the anchor by ice that had formed overnight. His posture suggested he had remained in place as conditions deteriorated, held there until injury and exposure ended all movement. Farther down the route, Arthur Brooke was located on a narrow ledge beneath a shallow overhang. His body was angled downhill, one knee bent beneath him, the other extended awkwardly toward open space. The snow around him showed shallow, irregular scrapes, short drags and partial slides, rather than the disturbance pattern of a long fall. His ice axe was still secured to his wrist, the pick buried lightly in the surface where it had last been driven in. There was no evidence of a secondary anchor or an attempted reset. Everything around him suggested a brief effort to stabilize, followed by loss of strength rather than sudden impact. The remaining climbers were found at separate points along the line of descent. One was suspended several feet off the wall, held in place by a frozen rope that had locked during a fall. The rope had cut a narrow groove into the ice where it had loaded under force. Another lay below a failed placement, his body positioned at the base of a steep step where the wall steepened abruptly. Their injuries were consistent with high-energy swings into the wall, blunt force combined with penetration from ice tools and crampon points, followed by prolonged exposure once movement stopped. Recovery took 2 full days. Teams rebuilt anchors one section at a time and freed ropes that had frozen solid into the ice overnight. Each body was lowered in controlled stages before equipment was removed and logged at safer ground. Inside Arthur Brooke's pack, rescuers found printed forecasts and saved phone screenshots showing earlier updates that suggested lighter winds and a possible clearing. Later advisories warning of extreme gusts were absent. Investigators concluded that Arthur, acting as the guide, had relied on that earlier information when deciding to proceed, a choice that set the group's timing and committed them to terrain with no clean exit once the storm arrived. Medical examiners determined that all 4 climbers died from catastrophic traumatic injuries sustained during falls and violent swings into the ravine walls, compounded by exposure. The injuries occurred at different points along the descent, but none were survivable. Based on fracture patterns and internal damage, loss of consciousness would have followed within seconds. There were no signs of prolonged struggle or delayed death. The outcome was sealed not by a single failure on the wall, but by the sequence that placed the group in that position when conditions deteriorated. The investigation found no unexpected weather event. The storm followed the forecast that had been issued before the climb began. Winds rose as predicted, ice loaded the ravine as warned, and visibility collapsed on schedule. What changed that morning was the information the group acted on. Arthur told them conditions were improving, and they trusted him as their guide. Each step deeper made reversal harder, until continuing felt safer than turning back. By the time the truth became unavoidable, retreat was no longer realistic. The climb ended not because the mountain behaved unpredictably, but because one decision removed every safer option that followed, and the ravine closed around it. Thank you for watching. If you're ready to see more Final Ascent videos, click right here.